Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to part 4 of the Tech Talk series, using the Power Platform to extend finance and operations apps. Today's topic is UI flows. My name is Nina, and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this web conference through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. Today's web conference is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. By participating in this session using Microsoft Teams, your name, email address, phone number, and/or title may be viewable by other session participants. If you do not consent to being a part of a recorded session, please disconnect at this time. Closed captioning will be available in the following languages: Spanish, French, German, Italian, Chinese, and Russian. To turn on closed captioning, click on the gear icon found on the lower right-hand corner of the video pane. From the pop-up menu, click on Captions Subtitles and select your language from the options that appear in the drop-down menu. The recording of today's session will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions throughout the event. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Rachel Profit, Senior Program Manager. Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Nina, and thank you everyone for joining today. I'm super excited to continue our series and really dive into robotic process automation and talk about how we can use UI flows. Again, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Profit. I'm a senior fast track solution architect based out of Denver, Colorado. I invite you to follow me on Twitter, connect with me on LinkedIn, or check out my blog at dynamics365lady.com. In today's session, we are going to be starting out by talking about use cases. So I'm going to introduce UI flows for those of you who may not be familiar with it, since it is a pretty new product to the family. And then we're going to discuss and talk through all the prerequisites that need to be in place and installed before you can start using the UI flows. I'll demonstrate an example of a UI flow that's triggered by a business event. So like an outbound example, and then I'll also show an example that is going to read an update. In my case, it's actually human resources, but one of our finance and operation apps. And then we'll kind of finish up by reviewing those do's and don'ts. So again, that flow here is going to start with that overview, talk through a bunch of different scenarios and examples. I'll show you how to get started, and then we'll switch to some samples and demonstrations and close out with the do's and don'ts. So robotic process automation, or RPA, is our capability that's available in Power Automate that's referred to as UI flows. When we think about using RPA with finance and operation apps, the scenarios that I think fit best into RPA with finance and ops, or ERP, fall into kind of two main categories. The first is for outbound scenarios, where we'll use a business event to trigger our UI flow, and then we would do automation in some other system. And typically that other system is going to be a system that doesn't have a connector, a native connector for Power Automate. And for the second scenario or category that I think UI flows and robotic process automation works well with your ERP and finance and operation apps, is where there's no data entity available for your particular data point, or a scenario where maybe there is an OData endpoint, but maybe there's not an OData action that allows us to perform a specific step. So these are those inbound scenarios where I want to automate something that happens inside of finance and operations, but I don't have a data entity, or maybe I don't have an OData action on an entity that allows me to click and perform something. So we can now automate these processes by using UI flows. So for those of you who are not familiar, Microsoft Power Automate and kind of the RPA and UI flow capabilities were announced and released in private preview in fall of 2019. That public preview was made available last November, so we're about a year old now. And the solution became generally available back in April. We continue to make investments in new features, and Power Automate is currently available in 9 regions and 43 different languages. We are continuing to make additional features and enhancements to it, and I'll actually be talking a little bit about one of those new features that's currently in preview, which is the new Power Automate desktop. The great thing about using UI flows is that you don't need complicated APIs or custom developed connectors. Any user who can operate a particular system, whether that be finance and operations for those inbound type scenarios or another external system, has the ability to record that task in either the Selenium IDE for web-based processes or the desktop recorder for Windows-based processes. And with the new Power Automate desktop, which, like I said, is currently in preview, you can actually do both of these things and record those tasks, whether they're web-based or desktop-based. The idea is that a user would record those tasks. You might add in some additional steps to help automate that task, and then we play back that task. And when we play back that task, it's basically us repeating that. So the idea is that we can bridge the gap between our old applications and our new applications. And even with finance and operation apps, where we do actually have APIs and a native connector for Power Automate, you don't have the ability to perform every action in the system. So there are a lot of buttons and things that you can do inside of finance and operations that aren't exposed through APIs or through OData actions. With Power Automate UI flows, that helps us bridge that gap and now makes it possible to integrate and automate all of your business processes without the need for coding. You'll want to still carefully consider your approach and volumes of data that will be processed with your automation scripts, as throttling or API limits may still come into play. A new UI flow with Power Automate can run in one of 2 modes, either attended or unattended. Attended is really intended for that individual citizen developer scenario, and it uses the local computer or device. And that process has to be kicked off by a human, clicking to actually start that process. While unattended is for enterprise scale type automation with high volumes. This is typically set up and installed on Windows Server 2016 or 2019, and it runs in the background. These types of flows are typically developed by an automation specialist or someone in your IT department or someone in your organization who is dedicated to RPA and automation or business process improvement. It's also important to remember that a flow might start out as attended, be developed by one of your users in a citizen developer type scenario, and it might later grow or be expanded into an automation process that's a more enterprise level type scenario. And at that point, you might switch it from being attended to unattended. So with that, I want to go ahead and switch gears and take a look at some scenarios. So the first 4 scenarios here that I've pulled together are organized departments, and they're all examples, and the statistics that are provided here are from Forrester. In the first example for HR, a staffing team wanted to reduce manual workloads for finding candidates and processing documents like I-9s, W-4s, and CVs or resumes. With RPA and optical character recognition, or OCR, and text analytics, the company was able to reduce human effort and intervention for exception processing, achieving automation rates of 80% for their printed forms and 42% for their handwritten forms. In the next example for finance, an organization that completes loan, insurance, and investment type transactions was manually aggregating data from more five or more different third parties, and many of those were like websites. And by using RPA, they were able to reduce the manual processes to only a few structured data fields. A bot was then able to execute the processes necessary to call out to those various websites to gather the additional necessary data. In the third scenario, we have a customer management type of scenario. And for this one, a provider of group disability insurance automated tasks such as policy cancellations that previously took 3 days from intake to completion and required work from multiple individuals within the organization. Now with the RPA in place, cancellations take a single day, and it's reduced the manual clicks in the system from 80 clicks down to 11, which also helped to improve the customer experience. In the last example, by departments, we have IT. So a telecom company wanted to automate the tedious and time-consuming task of backing up customer data. By using RPA, the company was able to consolidate data across all of its customers and phone systems and upload that data into an FTP server for backup. This resulted in a 99.9% reduction in time that was spent by the IT users performing those backups and a 0% error rate. So I've also put together a number of scenarios and examples that are more ERP and business process specific. So the first one, we have the quality example. The quality department at a manufacturing company was manually creating tests in their online lab management system. This is pretty common in a lot of manufacturing organizations. And that data was really being copied from the ERP system. And by using RPA, they were able to automate the creation of tests in their lab system. The results of the tests were also automatically recorded back into the ERP. So it gave it like a full circle type of scenario there with the quality management. In the next scenario, we have a document management scenario. So an organization is upgrading their ERP system and needs to move the on-premise documents that are related to data in their ERP, such as finance and operations, into a new SharePoint online library. By using RPA, the IT department was able to quickly and easily migrate documents from on-premise up to the cloud. Then we have a referral program example. So with this scenario, employees at a company can refer candidates for open positions in the organization and receive a reward. By using RPA, the company can automatically create workers and update referral information and notify the employee of the new hire once they've accepted their offer and give them information about their reward. The last example is for a merger or acquisition type of situation. So a company just acquired another company that is using an on-premise finance system that lacks APIs. IT needed to quickly get transactions from the new company's finance system into the cloud-based ERP. By using RPA, IT was able to quickly scale an integration to pull financial information between the two systems. You're thinking about where RPA might fit into your particular organization and processes, there are two main categories that we can break the scenarios down to: foundational and advanced. I recommend starting with some foundational examples and then working towards adding some more advanced capabilities later on. You can achieve a lot with just a little, and your flow doesn't have to have all the bells and whistles on day one. So the first key example here is repetitive, predictable, and predefined processes. These will typically have consistent sequence of steps that need to happen over and over. As you grow and expand with these types of scenarios, you can start to look at infusing AI capabilities. And this will help to expand the scenario and overall impact of your automation. So as a real life example here, I'm going to take a simple one that I think is kind of obvious and a lot of people think about in their organizations is AP automation. So maybe as a foundational or first step with your Power Automate UI flow, you start with just automatically scanning and attaching those documents into the system, because maybe the workers are manually scanning and manually attaching, and that's, you know, a handful of additional clicks for every invoice. If you think you process, say, 1,000 invoices with 4 additional clicks or 5 additional clicks, that's 4,000 to 5,000 clicks that you can get rid of by just automating that process of just attaching. But then later, when you've kind of gotten comfortable with the basics, you can start to infuse AI capabilities like optical character recognition, where we can scan that information and start to take data off of those invoices and automate even more. The next key scenarios to look at are mapped to your worker efficiency and productivity. So you'll want to look at how long each of the various tasks that take up your worker's time, you know, and that a specific worker does, and see what you can speed up with RPA. Then, as you grow and you're ready to take your flow to the next level, you can start to think about how you can augment your flow with a varying degree of human interaction. You'll want to think about ways that you can increase the potential outcomes. So, what can your users do, or what do your users know that a machine or robot can't? And focus your workers on those types of tasks, and the other more mundane types of tasks are what you can look to automate. This will also help to ensure that you're getting the most value out of your workforce and out of your, you know, robots, so to speak, your UI flow. The last example I have today is to look for scenarios that have a high return on investment or total cost of ownership, ROI or TCO. If you can reduce that ROI or TCO with accuracy and consistency, then you may have a good fit for RPA. Once you've deployed your solution, you can again look to expand by combining it with parts of a broader solution or a more broad automation scenario. So if we go back to that simple example of vendor invoicing, I might have started with just some very basic you know, automatically attaching documents that were sent to an email, or we scan the documents and they go into a folder and then they automatically get attached. But then when I'm looking for my ROI and total cost of ownership, I might want to look to using those OCR capabilities, but maybe I want to go a little bit further with that and start looking at, well, how can I scan my product receipts now and automatically match those against my invoices, so we get that comparison of the two documents to each other. So, you know, not only am I scanning my invoices, but I'm now also scanning my receipts and trying to match those up together using AI and automation. And so now I can start to piece all of these little pieces together and make a much more broad scenario for my automation. So some examples that we can take a look at here, where we can kind of compare attended versus unattended UI flows. And I've broken them down into columns as well for citizen developer-led type scenarios and an automation center of excellence, or someone who might be doing this more from an IT perspective if you don't have a center of excellence. So for the attended examples, we have like compiling P&L statements. So this is likely, you know, something that an accounting manager can likely do within your organization. The second example here, like removing users from systems after they leave. This could be driven by someone in HR or maybe even IT, like an HR generalist or, you know, an IT help desk type person who has the need to do these tasks, and they're kind of repetitive and mundane. They're still very important and need to be done, but maybe you know, we can get rid of some of those steps and clicks by automating it with an attended UI flow. When we think about attended examples that, you know, are a little bit more center of excellence led, a receptionist check-in process or call center agent acceleration process are two great examples. Now, when we kind of switch gears and think about unattended, these are things where, you know, the user doesn't want to be there to actually click the button, you know, so we're going to run this unattended. So the example here is like, it could be Excel, it could be PowerPoint, it could be PDF, it could be really, you know, whatever you want it to be. But we want those reports sent out every Sunday night. And so instead of having that be attended and I click the button and say when I want it to happen, I schedule that with another Power Automate flow that's set up with a recurrence and automate those different steps to convert maybe my Excel document into a PowerPoint, or maybe even I log into a system and generate a physical report and output that to PDF or output it to Excel, and then maybe run a macro on it or something like that. When we think about Automation Center of Excellence lead scenarios for unattended, this could include things like invoice processing or claims processing. So, the example that I was talking about with invoice automation is a great example that would likely be unattended, and it would require a little bit more than your citizen developer scenarios to make sure that you're covering all the scenarios and you're making an enterprise grade type of UI flow. So now that we've heard about how you might use UI flows, I want to switch gears and show you how to get started. So first up are the prerequisites. You'll need either a paid or a free trial license for Power Automate attended, or obviously you could use unattended if that's your intention as well. You'll also need a work or school account with admin privileges and Power Automate. So you'll need those admin privileges because you're going to be installing a number of things on your local computer in order to do the recording process. You'll need a Windows 10 Pro or Enterprise device, or you can use a Windows Server 2016 or 2019. Those enterprise grade type UI flows that are typically unattended are most likely going to be done on a server, and you wouldn't really want to run those on your local PC. It can be run unattended on a local PC, but you'll want to consider, if that's your local PC and it's running a pretty heavy duty integration and kind of constantly running, it's going to be taking up a certain amount of, CPU and memory on that local machine. And that's why the Windows Server is typically better for those larger scale enterprise type scenarios. You'll also need a browser, a supported browser, which we support Microsoft Edge, and you do need version 80 or later, or a Google Chrome browser. You'll also need an environment with a common data service database. So just having a common data service environment is not enough. The CDS in that environment does need to have a database. And then you'll also need a supported keyboard. And obviously, if you're recording mouse clicks, you'll need a mouse as well. And for some additional details, you can go online and find the full list of all the keyboards and types of devices that are supported. So the first step is to install the desktop application. And the installer contains all the components that you need to record, edit, and test your automations. So you'll want to follow the instructions on that download. You'll open it up, run the file. It's typically going to be in your downloads file after you download it. And depending on what browser you're using, that behavior might change a little bit. If you're using Edge or Chrome, that changes a little bit how downloads are presented in the browser, but then you'll just kind of follow that wizard. You're going to select the options. So there's check boxes, which is what you see in the screenshot here on the right-hand side, where you can choose if you want to install the UI flows for Edge and Chrome, as well as the browser extensions. So this is the legacy way of creating UI flows. And you can also use that same wizard to install your Power Automate desktop. And then you'll click that install button at the bottom, and it will go through that installation process. On the next page of your wizard is where you'll need to select to enable your extensions. So if you are going to be using UI flows and you're going to record anything in a web browser, then you'll need to, that's going to be using Selenium, you'll need to enable the extensions. The legacy UI flow extension is different from the new Power Automate desktop extension, so it's important that you select the right one. It doesn't hurt anything. You can install all of them, and if you want to be able to switch back and forth between browsers or between Power Automate desktop and the legacy UI flows editor, you can do that as well. That won't hurt anything. And I strongly recommend after you enable those extensions that you also restart your browser. But then you can also launch your Power Automate desktop by using the button on the wizard. So when you're installing that Selenium IDE, you'll go through that process. I've included the link here on the slide, which will be provided. So you'll download and install that for Edge or Chrome. And if you're using Edge, you'll also need to mark and click the button that allow extensions from other stores. And then once you do that, then you can click Add to Chrome. Again, I do recommend that you restart your browser after you install that Selenium IDE. Another component that you may need is an on-premise data gateway. This is used if you're planning to trigger your UI flow from another flow. So if that's an event, a schedule, or a button flow on a remote device. So the links here provide some additional information on how exactly to install and configure that on-premise data gateway. So now that you've installed and configured all those different prerequisites, you'll need to create a UI flow connection. This will be used to connect your UI flow from your standard flow. If you aren't planning to, create a standard flow and connect, to a UI flow and fully automate it, and a user's always going to click to run that flow from either Power Automate Desktop or from the UI flows in the web browser, you don't need to do this step. It's just if you're going to have that gateway, but you can see there's a screenshot here where you put in that domain and username information and select the correct gateway that you want to connect to that you've installed on your local computer or on your server. So now that we've kind of taken a look at all these different prerequisites that you'll need to do, I want to switch gears and take a look at some real life examples. So the first example here, this is actually one of my clients. They're about to go live in 2 or 3 weeks, and they're currently using Dynamics AX 2012. And they are upgrading everything to finance and operations, but they had used the HR module pretty extensively, along with a fair number of customizations, and they're now re-implementing their HR module on Dynamics 365 Human Resources. They had a requirement that they needed to migrate all of their document handling attachments from their workers. And they were stored in a network share with their AX 2012 implementation. However, in human resources, there's no data entity for document handling attachments. And with HR, we don't have the ability to create or extend data entities. Now, you could use this exact same scenario, an example in a finance and operations scenario as well with finance or supply chain management. But keep in mind that you do have the ability to extend and create new data entities in finance and operations. So you'll need to decide what the best approach is for your implementation. So the way they handled this was by creating a new UI flow. And just as a side note from a prerequisite, they actually migrated all of the documents from their on-premise network to the new SharePoint Online Library. And they did that kind of outside of the UI flow. They did that using PowerShell scripts. You could technically add additional steps to do this migration from, a network share into a SharePoint library. But the PowerShell scripts probably perform a lot better than using a UI flow. So once they had finished that migration, then they created a new UI flow. So when you're in Power Automate in the Maker portal online, you'll click that new button and then select UI flow from blank from that drop-down box. So the next thing they did was they, in their case, they chose the Selenium IDE. You'll notice that when you're starting a brand new flow, you are given the option to use the new Power Automate Desktop. You can use the Windows Recorder, or you can use the Selenium IDE. And then you'll need to click that Next button. Once you've started that flow, you'll need to give your flow a name. So you'll name it, and then you'll put in your URL. For their example, they actually put the URL, and in part of their human resources URL, they included the variable or modifier at the end of the URL for the actual company and for the worker page. You don't have to do that, but it's certainly more efficient to do that because it'll take you right into that specific page. Then you don't have to, navigate from your home page. You can definitely navigate to that home page and then click, on the navigation pane or search for a page just like you normally would, but those are additional steps. And when you kind of multiply it out by 7,000 of these things, if there are clicks or steps you can eliminate, that will always help to make the process more efficient. It is important that your URL does have to be a real URL, otherwise that launch recorder button won't be available. So once you put a real URL in, you can click that button, and then it'll open up the Selenium recorder. So that Selenium recorder up in the upper right-hand corner is a little REC red button that you can click on. And once you click on that record button, it will open a fresh browser for you, and then you can record your steps. In this case, right, they navigated into the worker, searched for the correct worker, opened up the document handling, and then clicked the new button to insert that file. And then they put in a name for the file and a path for the file, save the record, and close down the forms. Obviously, your steps might be different, slightly different, and you can record steps of anything. In this case, we're recording human resources. It could be finance and operations. It could be commerce. It could be really just about anything that you want to record. You'll also notice in this screenshot here that there were a number of things that they needed to use a variable for. So the variables are expressed, you don't use the quotes, you just use the $sign and some parentheses, and then you'll put the variable name in between the parentheses. So in the screenshot example here, you can see a file name. There's also a file path, and up further, which you can't see it in the screenshot, is a personnel number. And so these are placeholders and they become variables. So when you run your flow, you can pass in values from your standard flow into your UI flow. And that's important because, you wouldn't want to have to run this flow. If you had 1,000 workers, you wouldn't have to run it, wouldn't want to have to run it 1,000 times. So once they had created the UI flow that does the actual clicking inside of human resources, what they did next was they created an instant flow. Since this was a one-time data migration effort, the instant flow made a lot of sense. So they selected to manually trigger a flow. There were no input variables for that. Just when they were ready to run that as a part of their cutover process, they would go trigger this flow. Then they created 3 variables. So a variable for the worker, a variable for the path, and a variable for the file. The next step in your flow is going to be one of 2 things. In their example, and I didn't include a screenshot because it has a lot of their specific SharePoint information, but I'll show you an example in my demo. If you put your documents into a SharePoint list, which is actually what they did in their example, you will use the get items action from SharePoint. If you put your documents into a SharePoint document library, you will use the get files action from SharePoint. So it's slightly different, and the parameters that you pass in and that you need will be slightly different. So once they did that, then they were ready to kind of say, okay, so for each item that is in that SharePoint list, we want to loop through those. So there's an apply to each, and for each one of these, we set the variable. So in their case, they set the variable for the file, and they use the file name. They set the variable for the path, and they're using the SharePoint location. This is a little bit different because in their example, they used a SharePoint list. If you're using a SharePoint library instead of the SharePoint location, you're going to want to use the full path on a document library. So it depending on which way you go, it'll be slightly different. And then they set the variable for the worker. Now, in their example, they used the worker name. One of the things that you'll want to be careful of is the worker is technically not a unique identifier for a worker. So in my example, when I set this up, I switched this. Instead of using a worker name, I used a personnel number. In their case, it worked fine because they don't happen to have any workers with the same exact name. But if you did have two John Smiths, for example, you might run into problems. So I would generally recommend using a key field as your variable, so that way when you look this up. So the next thing they did was they added a condition here. And so what they were doing here is checking for the status of the file in SharePoint. Because sometimes the files failed and they might need to do another run. And I'll talk a little bit more about reasons why it might fail. So they added a status field into their SharePoint list, but you could do the same thing in a document library as well. But this is a good kind of best practice, kind of check here to check to see. And in their case, the status was okay that they were checking for. So once they did that, then they added another action to run a UI flow for web. And so here you can see in their case, the three kind of purple fields, these are the variables. The standard fields that you will get on your UI flow are the name of the UI flow, where you get a drop-down box, which web browser you want to use, and the run mode. This is where you're going to choose if it's going to be attended or unattended. The next one is the next three fields here are dynamic. This is going to be dependent on your UI flow. If you don't have any variables, then nothing will show up here. In this case, they had the three variables for worker name, file name, and path. So they get the three additional fields here, and they passed in the variables that they set earlier. Then the next thing that they've done here is they've added another condition, and in this case, they're checking for the body of that UI flow and checking to see if it contains error. So that's checking to see, did the UI flow run successfully? If that UI flow ran successfully, then they have a yes path and a no path. They're both exactly the same. The only difference is that on the yes path, they're and both of them are using the update item. If you are using a folder, it's not an update item, it's a update. I think it's called update file is the name of the action that you would use. And so if I were to expand this, you would just see that they're setting the status. So if there's an error, they set the status to error. And if there's no error, they set the status to okay. So that way, if any of them fail, they get set to error and they can run it again, fix whatever the problem might be, and then go on. Another tip for you, when you're first connecting to a UI flow, you'll get the previous screenshot that I showed when I was showing how to set up the on-premise gateway, and you'll have to make that connection for the first time if you didn't make a connection. So that will kind of change the behavior a little bit. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and switch over and show you a little bit about how to do this Selenium recording. All right, so for this example, I'm going to go ahead and create a new recording. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm in Power Automate Desktop, which is the new preview. So I'm going to go ahead and click on New. I'm going to just call this Tech Talk for this example and click Create. And then it will open up another new window. Did it go behind? It did. That's okay. And while that's loading here, I'm going to hop over to my browser. Let's refresh here. I'm going to grab the URL of my HR environment. So I'm just copying that URL. And what I'm going to do from the Power Automate Desktop, I'm going to click on Tools in the Action pane and then choose Web Recorder. This will open up a new window where I can now choose which type of browser I want to use. So I'll choose Microsoft Edge. You can also click Advanced and put some additional, details in here. But I'm just going to keep it simple for this example and then click on Next. So you can see it opens up this little like web recorder window where you can see what's happening. I'm going to go ahead and paste in this URL, and you'll notice, oh, sorry, I need to go back. I forgot to click Start Recording. Now I'm going to do it again. So I click start recording, paste that in there. And you'll notice that it'll update this step with the actual URL. And as I start to click through the system, it's going to record each of my steps. So I'm going to click on the hamburger menu. You can see it put that in there. If you want to add a comment on these steps, you can do that as well. I'm going to click personnel management, and then I'm going to click on links. Then I'm going to click on workers. And it's going to open up my worker page. Then I'm going to filter for a particular worker. Press enter. And then I'll select that worker, go in to the attachments, and then I'll click the new button to add a file. In my case, I'm going to choose URL. And I'm actually going to pause recording here for a moment because I want to show you one thing about this that you might try to do this, and if you try, and I'm going to move this off screen for a second so we can see this a little better. When you choose to add a file, it'll open a dialog and there is a browse button here. You can record to click this browse button and it will put it in your web recorder. However, Selenium is not able to click this button, this browse button. There's other buttons that are like this in the system as well, because this button actually opens a new window that is a desktop like Windows Explorer window. So even though it will let you record the browse click, you couldn't click on the Windows desktop to record those steps, so you wouldn't be able to upload that file. There is a workaround. It is quite technical, and the workaround, just as a side note, is to hit F12 on your browser and then find the name of the element. And in this case, you would want the element of the actual file name that's being passed in here. And you would manually add a step into your Selenium recorder or to the desktop recorder to actually pass in that value into this field. So it's basically like you're tricking it. Even though you can't do this in the user interface, the Selenium would let you pass these values in, and then you'd be able to click OK. So that's kind of the technical workaround, and you do have to kind of dig through the browser, and unfortunately when you open F12, like none of the elements are named very friendly. They're called like input 1 and input 4 and input 5, and so you'll have to kind of play around with it and figure out what the name of that actual field is, and depending on your form it might be different. So what we actually did here instead, if I go back and start my recording again, was we chose to do a URL. So new URL, then we put in a name for the file, and then we put in a URL for the file. I'm just going to paste the URL in here. You wouldn't use this URL obviously in real life, but I'm going to replace both the name for the file and this URL that I pasted in here with a variable. And so I would click save. I'd close down my windows when I'm done. And when I'm finished, I click finish. Obviously, you can keep recording. You can see all the different steps in here. One of the things that you will likely need to do is to add in some wait time, because when I go back to run this and play this, it might work the first time, it might not. And a lot of it has to do with the speed at which a page loads. So it's like a robot and it's just trying to go click. But lots of web pages, especially when you open a brand new form, it might take longer for it to load. So you can see it's going to personnel management, links, and then it's going to worker. And it is working this time, but if the page isn't fully loaded and you try to like do whatever that next step is, and it's probably errored out here because it tried to start typing into this field before the form had fully rendered. So the way you fix that is if you come back into Selenium, and you can see where it errored out, and I recommend doing it like on any new forms that you're clicking, because any new page that loads, you'll need some wait time. And obviously, depending on your connection, if your internet's like bad tonight when it's running, it might need more wait time. So to add a wait time into a flow, there's a bunch of actions you can add here. All you do is you just drag and drop it in there. And then you say, oh, I want to wait 2 seconds. You hit save, and obviously you can add as many of these weights, but there's all sorts of other things you can do with this Power Automate. Once you're done, you save this. Now you've got the UI flow saved that you can start to put into your regular flow. So you can see it saved. I can keep making changes to this. This is over here on the right is where I would add and change these inputs. So you would add those inputs. And you can see right where I populated that text. So this is where I would want to edit that and change it to a variable instead of my hard-coded value. So what I want to do is I want to switch to the browser and show you the actual flow. So I'm over here in Flow. I'm going to open up this one. No, this is the UI flow. I want to go to the regular flow. So I'm on the UI flows tab right now. So, and you'll notice when you are in the Power Automate Maker portal, there's a separate tab where your UI flows go. If I switch back over to my flows, this is where I can see the actual flow that I created. So there's my update personnel files. And if I click edit on this, this is my instant flow that is running this. So I've got the manually trigger, I'm initializing the variable. I'm using a get files in my example. So I'm getting the files and then I'm using that apply to each. I'm setting the variables, and now in this next step, that's where I'm ready to add in my UI flow. So when you're ready, you add in the UI flow, spelling counts. So you can find that UI flow. You can choose which type of flow it is. So is it one built by Power Automate Desktop or Selenium, etc. And then you'll use the drop-down box to choose which flow that you want. There's the Tech Talk one. You choose your run mode, attended or unattended. I didn't put variables in this, so I'm not getting variables. But if you had variables, that's where I would pass those variables in. Then I can continue like you saw in the screenshots and keep adding those actions. So it's a pretty easy process when you're done. Obviously, you'll want to save it and test it. One of the things that I always recommend with your UI flow when you're doing the recording is test it once before you add your variables. Make sure that all of your clicks are working and your wait times are working. Before you kind of swap out the hard-coded values, so to speak, for the variables that you want to pass in. And then once you do variables, you'll need to kind of call it from another flow to be able to pass those variables in. All right, so that wraps up that example that I wanted to show. So we're going to go back and talk about the second example. So the second example is that quality management example. So the way I started here was by creating an alert rule. So just standard alert rule functionality when a quality order is created. And then I created a standard Power Automate flow that uses the trigger when a business event occurs. Just like always, when you're using this business event, you'll want to parse the JSON. So I added another step to parse the JSON, and then I used the get record. So the get record is used to open up and find the actual quality order header in my case. But you could get multiple records depending on if you needed, product details from the release products. You could do as many gets and save off variables and things like that that you need from as many records. But I use get record to do that. And then the next step is to actually call the UI flow. In my case, I use the Selenium IDE recorder to go record that. And then, after that, right, we actually now officially have more than 400 connectors. The theme used to be more than 300, but now we have more than 400. And you can now do whatever you want. So if you want to also send emails, get approvals, send text notifications, whatever it might be, all of those possibilities that you have with the 400 plus connectors are available to you. So with that, I want to go ahead and switch back over. I'm going to show you my flow and how to record those steps with this particular example. All right, so in this particular example, I am going to open up, thank you, I know about the Power Automate Desktop. So I've created a flow out here called Quality Assurance Tests. I'm going to go ahead and click Edit on this. So this will open up, my flow. And so I've started this flow here. I've got my when a business event occurs. It's set to the alerts. When an alert rule is triggered in USMF. If you have lots of alert rules in your particular environment, you'll want to make sure, and Murray showed this in part 3, where we dived into this in a little bit more detail, you'll want to click on that settings. And down towards the bottom, you'll want to add a condition to filter for a specific table ID or whatever you want to filter by, so that this flow only runs for your quality scenario. I only have one alert rule in my environment, so I didn't need to do that, but you'll want to make sure that you consider that. Then I parse that JSON. If you don't know what your JSON is, you can get your JSON from the business events catalog, just like normal. So I'm here in that business events catalog. I already had it open. And then you'll just click on that download schema. So this will download a little text document. And if we click on that to open it, there it is. Copy and paste that information and go back to the flow. The way this works, if you don't already have it in there, the content will always be the body of the previous step. And then you would say generate from sample, paste in the text that you copied from the downloaded schema, and then it'll paste it in here for you. The next step here is that I'm getting a record. So in my case, I'm getting the record here for my quality order header. So connecting to my environment, the entity name in my case was quality order header, and I'm passing in the object ID, which in this case, because it's coming from an alert rule, it's the key value 1 or key value 2. It could be both. It depends on what entity you're working with. And now I'm ready to go ahead and do a new step and call my UI flow. So if I come over here, right, I'm going to do a UI flow that's built with Selenium. And then I will choose my quality order lab tests. I choose which browser I want to use. I choose my run mode. Again, if your flow has variables in it, you'll see those, but you'll also get some advanced options if you want a step delay. So this is a feature that you can use to just tell it to automatically add a time in between every step, and you'll express this in milliseconds. So, if you want to wait 2 seconds, then you'd put 200 in here. You can also put a timeout in here. So some additional settings to kind of help with that delay. But if you have especially long running steps or forms in whatever application you're opening, you might not want to wait that long between every step. So that's the advantage to just adding that wait manually into your flows where you want it to wait. You'll just need to consider that. Once you're ready, you can go ahead and save this. I'll go ahead and save and go back. I wasn't logged into my, that's okay. What I want to show you now is the UI flow that's related to this. So that UI flow was already pre-created. So here's my quality order lab test. If I click on this edit icon, this is going to open up the Selenium IDE. So this is the traditional, editor for the recorder. So there in the upper right hand corner is where you can see the record button. So I've already recorded these steps. I've got hard coded values in here, and I might need to add wait steps. If you want to test this before you start switching out for variables, so like if I wanted to switch this from just like some value that I made up and typed in when I was doing the demo, what I would do is come down here to the value, and this is where I would type in $, and then use my parentheses and say quality order number. So now I've got a variable in this that I can use to pass in the quality order number. I'm just going to put some random numbers back in there. I'm going to go ahead and click play on this. This will error out because this website, it's a free quality lab management system, and this pop-up keeps coming up about the password. So I have to click. I can resume it. In real life, you wouldn't want to use this particular quality management system, but the idea here is that I can record steps in anything. I just found this free demo quality management lab system in here, and recorded some steps. But the idea is that it would put the tags in, it would put the the experiment details in, a title in, that sort of thing in my steps. So you can see it's failing here. And the reason it's failing was because I got that pop-up and it's unaware of that pop-up. And you'll run into some situations like this where the behavior when you record is slightly different than the behavior when it runs as a test. And part of that is because when Selenium runs, it always opens up a fresh browser. So you'll want to carefully test that and make sure that it's working both ways. And sometimes you might have to manually add a step in here to make it execute and not error out. So obviously the steps that you record, it could be any web browser, it could be a desktop application, it could be anything you want, but you're going to record those. And the key is like wherever you need to put a variable in, you're going to change that value to be a variable using that syntax $ with the parentheses and then type in a name for it. And that's what you can pass in from your other flow. All right. So one last slide before we open it up for Q&A. Some do's and don'ts. So do make sure that, and I didn't show this, but when you have a UI flow that's running through that on-premise gateway, to see the flow runs and the history of every time it ran, you actually do that from the on-premise gateway. So when you're in, I'll just switch back to the demo really quick and show you. So not that window. This window. So if you go down to data and then gateways, this is where you will see your on-premise gateway. So if you click on your particular gateway that you're using, this is where you can see the UI flow runs for that particular gateway. So you can see what's been running on that particular gateway. So that's just a little tip for you to be aware of. When you create your on-premise gateway, it's just for you, whoever installs that, but you might need to share your gateway. So consider, and those are additional steps that you have to go through if you want other people to be able to use that gateway, especially in enterprise type scenarios where you've got a server set up with that gateway and you want to just kind of use that server for running these automations. Do use a standard Power Automate flow to call a UI flow. So when you want to fully automate that process and get your UI flow to run and pass in variables, just use a standard Power Automate flow. It doesn't matter if it's an instant flow or it's got a trigger on it. You saw 2 examples today. One was automated, one was instant, but you could do scheduled flows as well to call that UI flow. If you are going to be passing sensitive data such as usernames and passwords, which is very common when you're opening applications that you need to log into that application, make sure that you use secure inputs and outputs. You'll find that underneath on your flow. You'll click the ... button and then choose settings. And then there's 2 parameters, one for inputs and one for outputs. And that encrypts that data so that you're not just passing passwords back and forth between the cloud and on-premise. And make sure that you add wait time for any long running processes or slow opening forms in your recordings. Some things not to do. Don't install the on-premise gateway if it's not needed. So if your users are going to go click the play icon to run it, you don't need the on-premise gateway. But if you're going to fully automate it with another flow, you will need that. Don't use Selenium to try to record desktop applications. It might look like it's recording, but it doesn't. And even that example that I talked about with the browse button that opens a desktop window, the Windows Explorer window, that doesn't actually work in Selenium. So it's limited. If you're curious about what is and is not supported by Selenium, they have a great website that you can go check out and see what is and is not supported from a recording standpoint. Don't use a gateway on your local computer for an enterprise process, because if you're running like vendor invoice automation on your local computer, like that's going to be taking up CPU and memory and so on your local computer. And especially if it's attended, if you click while an attended flow is running, it can actually like stop the flow because you've taken the focus away from what it was trying to do. If you need to be able to do other work, then make sure that you're using an unattended flow if you do have a local flow. And then don't use a UI flow if you can use OData entities and actions with a standard flow. So you know, if there is an OData entity and there's OData actions for your particular scenario, though that's always going to be a better option. There's more validation and so on with that. Only use these UI flows in scenarios where you don't have the OData entity or the actions. So with that, I do invite you to make sure that you sign up and join us on the next couple of parts in the series. Part 5, 6, and 7 are all really going to be focused on Power Apps. So we're going to take a look at Canvas apps, model-driven apps, and portals. And then part 8, starting in December, we're going to switch gears and talk about Power Virtual Agents. So with that, we'll open it up for questions. I do see that we've had a number of them come through. Chris or Murray, if we want to kind of review some of those questions that have come through. Let's see.
Oh, sorry. Hi, Rachel. This is Chris.
Yeah. Hi, Chris.
Hi. I was talking to a muted microphone. Yeah, so there was some questions that came through. One of the first questions was saying that they had tested UI flows against finance and operations to automate manual entry of products, and that the web experience was not recorded well. Any suggestions? And I gave the tips of slowing down to 3/4 speed and or adding a 1 to 2 second delay, and then potentially targeting different attributes. You mentioned the delay. I wonder if you had also had experimented with targeting attributes before.
Yeah, so I will tell you, even when I was recording, the Selenium IDE is a little bit more tricky than the new Power Automate desktop. The Selenium IDE like recognizes every like little element on the form, and so like it might look like you're clicking on a field, but you're not, and so you have to kind of like move your mouse slightly out to get it. And so I hear you. I get what you're kind of talking about, and that might be what you were running into. When you use the Power Automate desktop, it kind of blurs a lot of that, so it's not actually it's a lot easier to click on the right thing. You still might struggle with it a little bit, and I found a few spots, especially on really small buttons, like the document handling button was one that I kind of struggled with because it's so tiny, and to get it to click on the whole button and not on, you know, like the icon itself, because like you don't want it, like it recognizes that there's a button there and you want to make sure that you're getting the button. When you hover over things, one of the nice things about Selenium, when you hover over something, it tells you what it is. And if it is a button, you want to make sure that you're on button, and it'll say like button 5 or button 6 or whatever the number of the button is on the form. If it says like control 1 or control 2, you don't actually have the button. It's like you've got like the outside of that button, which is oftentimes like the field group or something like that, or the button group, and you don't have the specific button. So you might run into things like that. Another thing that I found when I was recording too was sometimes it was easier to use keyboard shortcuts to execute buttons. So if you're having trouble getting it to like, you know, do exactly what you're look at using keyboard shortcuts, because you can navigate the entire system using keyboard shortcuts. It's obviously a little bit less natural, but it guarantees that you're clicking the right thing. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, and kind of implicit in what you were saying was try using Power Automate Desktop instead of Selenium. Yeah.
And I know that's new, so it may not have been available when you were kind of playing around with this, but you know, it is you know, available now. So check it out, try it, see if it makes it easier.
Right, and someone right after him asked the specific question of regarding web recording, which is recommended, Power Automate Desktop or Selenium, and I pointed out that Power Automate Desktop is the recommended solution. I couldn't find any official documentation on that. I reached out to someone on the Power Automate RPA team and they said, yeah, they don't have like a comparison there. Selenium is an open source product that has a large community, so it might be needed in some situations, but where possible, use Power Automate Desktop. And Rachel, you've had great experience with that.
Yeah, I found the desktop to be way easier to use, and you get a lot more actions and things that you can do in Power Automate Desktop by just dragging and dropping. Like I only showed the weight. There's like hundreds of actions that you can drag and drop in from Power Automate Desktop.
Nice.
Yeah.
Someone asked which browser is the best to use, Edge, and I commented Edge Chromium or Google Chrome. Have you noticed any difference between the two?
You know, I would say it depends on your application. I found when I was recording finance and operations, I found Edge to be easier. But when I was doing my quality assurance one, I actually found Google Chrome to be easier. So it kind of depends a little bit, I think, on your web application. And keep in mind too, like depending on your web browser, like the behavior of, and make sure that you're always starting fresh on a clean browser, and like you don't save sign-ins and all sorts of stuff like that, because like when you record it, it might be using a save sign-on, but then when it runs in real life, it's going to use, like it's not going to know what user to sign in on, especially like if you're using unintended on a server or something like that. So that can be a little tricky, and the behavior is slightly different between Chrome and Edge. But I would say it depends on the web application. Right. Choose the browser that works best with that particular web application, and that might vary by your web application.
Right. So the next question was about the on-prem data gateway and whether that can be used for on-prem finance and operations instances. I mentioned that they should be accessible via URL, so the data gateway shouldn't be needed for accessing those. However, a data gateway is needed to run a UI flow unattended. Did you want to comment on that more?
No, I think you explained that pretty well. The gateway is there so that the flow can communicate with your local computer when it's running, you know, unattended.
Right. And maybe related or maybe not, someone asked, can the data from, for example, a SQL Server connector be used in a UI flow? The scenario would be to use data from an on-premise database to create sales orders in Dynamics 365 supply chain. So I mentioned that, yes, an API flow can pass data into a UI flow, and that a SQL Server connector is available. And we just talked about the on-premise gateway as well. You got any comments on that question?
No. I did see someone, another one that I did want to comment on. Someone asked if the workaround for file uploading, recording is documented or blogged somewhere. It's not blogged specific to F&O. We'll look to try to get something published here, you know, in the next month or two that is specific to F&O, but the workaround is published in a blog. And I will make sure that that link gets added to this deck so that you can see, you know, what that workaround is. The example that was shown, they were trying to do it on like a Bing site, and they were uploading images to Bing Images. And so they did an example there. So I will find that blog and make sure that that's posted. The same basic principle applies to F&O. I will just tell you, it is quite a bit more difficult on F&O because like our elements, when you go into that F12 developer kind of mode in your browser, it like elements are not easily named or found. It's not like the browse button is not called the browse button, so you can't even like search through it. You kind of have to like dig through the tree and like click on it. When you're using the Selenium, and this is one nice thing about the Selenium IDE, when you're using the Selenium IDE, you can see like when you click on something, it'll highlight it if you are selected on the right object. So that's one nice thing that you get with Selenium that you wouldn't get with the Power Automate desktop.
Right. Yeah, and kind of implicit in that comment that you just made is, yeah, we'll need to follow up with some documentation related to all these tips and tricks that we're giving related to kind of integration of the Power Platform and finance and operations. There's a couple of places that documentation is living right now, but we might have to create kind of a center of excellence based on this web series, this presentation series that you're going through, Rachel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great idea. All right, I think that was all the questions that we had today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to Nina to wrap us up.
All right, thank you, Rachel. So I've posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel. We'd like your feedback on today's session and to hear what you'd like to see in future events. The survey scores are on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible. Thank you for your participation. As a reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters and to our audience for logging in and joining us today. Please stay safe and have a great rest of your day or evening wherever you are.